Burnice is the hottest and newest character coming to Zenless Zone 0, and a lot of people, myself included, have been hyping her up. And not just for being our first dedicated off-field unit, but also because her kit as a whole is going to be very beneficial for some teams. That being said, in today's video I want to talk about the advantages but also the downsides of pulling for Burnice. Because this is a gacha game after all, which means that resource management is essential for you to get a powerful account with the characters that you want for you to have the most fun with the game. And so in today's video, I really want to break down how valuable Burnice is going to be for your account at different breakpoints, be it a free-to-play player, low spenders, dolphins, or even whales. Because for all the praise that me and many others have given Burnice, and not just for her gorgeous looks, stunning physics, and beautiful animations, there's a few downsides that should be taken into account when it comes to deciding to get Burnice that I don't think a lot of people have been talking about. So with that being said, hello everyone, my name is DarkHero and let's begin. So let's start by addressing pull value, along with some of her positives and negatives, highlight some of her unique mechanics, and why many players are going to be using Burnice wrong, because despite her having a very simple kit, she actually has a lot of nuance and things for you to optimize, and we're also going to be talking about how she's going to fit into many different teams, as well as her long-term viability. Now we all know that Burnice is going to be an off-field anomaly character, as by building up her gauge, she's able to scorch the enemies, leaving them with afterburn, and then you can swap to your main DPS and attack them, and as you hit these enemies they're going to trigger the afterburn damage, which can actually crit for some additional damage. And because her entire kit revolves around building up these afterburns, as well as quickly but also effortlessly building up the fire anomaly, she is naturally going to pair very well with other anomaly characters. And this is even more evident with the additional ability, the fire kindling, that by having another anomaly character or a character of the same faction, the Sons of Koleda, the fire anomaly buildup of the afterburn effect is going to be increased, and the duration of the burn effect is also going to be extended, which means that a second anomaly character would have plenty of time to be able to trigger their own anomaly effect. So for example, if it is Jane Doe, you'll be able to trigger Assault, and because you are going to have the burn effect constantly active, you'll be able to have both trigger at the same time, which means that you'll be able to trigger Disorder and thus deal a lot more damage. Now despite how simple this sounds, there's a couple of limitations that this imposes. Firstly is that to get the highest value possible out of Burnice, you're going to need to pair her up with an on-field anomaly DPS character, of which currently there's only 3, those being Grace, Piper, and Jane Doe, with Yanagi being a future release anomaly character, but I'll talk about her specifically more in depth and how she is going to interact with Burnice a little bit later into the video. Now naturally, if you don't have a Jane Doe or a Grace already well built, or even a Piper for that matter, you're going to be missing out on a lot of Burnice's value, as all the other characters in the game besides maybe Nekomata have a hard time building up the anomaly effect, and so your overall damage value is going to have a much lower ceiling. The second thing that you need to take into account is that there are actually some complications with applying this off-field DPS, because you actually need to swap to Burnice and manage her energy and her heat gauge properly to then apply the scorched effect on enemies. And when it comes to the endgame of Zenless Zone 0, which is where all the nuance becomes a lot more important, and in Shield defense you always have different waves of enemies, which means that even for the smaller enemies, you will need to swap into Burnice to apply the scorched effect, and then swap into your main DPS to finish them off, but in some cases that likely is going to lead to a scenario where you don't have a lot of energy with Burnice for the second wave of enemies, or at the same time you could have your main DPS finish off the entire first wave without Burnice coming on field, but at that point why have Burnice on the team? So there might be some inconsistencies there which I think it's important to pay attention to. And the second thing is that naturally, because Burnice is an anomaly character that is focused on working with other anomaly characters, you're going to need to pay attention to how you use your anomaly characters, because if you don't, you're going to trigger the anomaly effects maybe a little bit later, and in case you didn't know, the disorder damage that you get from combining 2 different anomaly effects is actually affected negatively by how long it takes you for you to trigger the anomaly effects. So if there is, for example, a 5-second gap between when you trigger the burn effect with Burnice and when you trigger shock with Grace for the disorder, the damage output is going to be much lower. So Burnice's teams are going to require a little bit more brain power than some others where it's just about having a stunner, a support character, and a main DPS, or especially in comparison to Jane Doe or Piper's teams where it's all about getting these support characters to buff the main DPS and then letting them do everything by themselves. I'm not saying that it's going to be too difficult, but when we combine this with some of the aforementioned nuanced mechanics, you are definitely going to need to think a little bit more about about what you are doing and not utilizing your character's resources at the wrong time. Now, Bernice does actually have some nuance when it comes to the way that you use your EX special attack. And this is actually very important because typically with anomaly characters in Zenless Zone 0, how effective they ends up being tied to how fast they are able to build up the anomaly effect. And with Bernice's flamethrower, you actually have different ways of utilizing your energy to build up the fire anomaly. So let's be specific about this. If you simply tap the EX special attack, Bernice is going to hit the enemy with a single flamethrower. However, if you then tap the EX special button again, Bernice will use a second flamethrower to apply the fire anomaly buildup much more effectively. So when you use a single flamethrower, I would say that consistently you're going to trigger about 50% of the anomaly buildup, but with two flamethrowers, aka using the EX special into another EX special, you'll be getting about 80% of the anomaly buildup. However, it will cost much more energy. Now here's the nuance, because when it comes to cost effectiveness for your energy, using a single EX special with a single flamethrower is going to be more effective. However, going back to how powerful anomaly characters are, it's all about building up the anomaly as quickly as possible to then be able to trigger the burn effect with fire anomaly, but also to combine it with other anomaly effects to get the disorder for that crazy damage bonus. And so I would argue that it is going to be much more effective for you as Bernice to always go for the double flamethrower and build up that anomaly as quickly as possible. And in addition to that, you may also want to use your ultimate depending on the situation as Bernice rather than Jane Doe or any other main DPS. And the reason for this is that whenever you use your ultimate as Bernice, you can actually animation cancel and swap into a different character, having both of them in the field dealing damage at the same time. And because Bernice is going to be building up a lot of fire anomaly, you can then have a different character, let's say Jane Doe for example, dealing physical damage to trigger assault at the same time and proccing disorder along the way, dealing much more damage. Maybe I shouldn't call this an animation cancel because it's actually a quick assist. So as long as you put Bernice before the main DPS on your team composition, you will be able to swap to that character whenever you perform Bernice's ultimate. And doing this will actually extend Bernice's ultimate duration, so it is definitely very beneficial for you to use this. Now, one thing to keep in mind is that the ZZZ developers have confirmed that they are going to change the way ultimates work in the game, as according to them, sometime in the future we're going to be able to use the ultimate for each of the different characters, whereas right now only one character in the entire team can use the ultimate. So naturally, whenever that change is in effect, you won't even have to consider using Bernice's ultimate or your main DPS's ultimate, but this is exactly what I meant when I said earlier that Bernice, despite having a very simple kit, has a lot of nuance to her, and a lot of players are going to be missing out on damage unless they go for these specific things. But ultimately, because Bernice is essentially going to act as the pillar for anomaly teams, I even compared her in a previous video to Honkai Star Rail's Topaz as being a damage focused character that is going to also help characters of the same type not only perform better but also excel at what they are already doing. The most important thing becomes, do you have characters that are going to pair well with Burnice? Now, I've mentioned Grace and Jane Doe a bunch throughout this video, so it goes without saying that anomaly characters are going to be the perfect pair. But you also need to think about the upcoming characters and the teams that you currently have to beat the Shiyu defense and get all 3 stars in every floor. Because while yes, these characters are going to have these very synergistic kits that are going to boost the effectiveness of other characters that have previously been featured in different banners, the way that Hoyoverse and every gacha game essentially sets this up is for them to be appealing not just visually but for these synergistic aspects. It's because these characters are so good with each other that they are released one after another, because unless you spend an entire patch or even 2 saving up for these characters, or unless you are incredibly lucky, you're not going to be able to get both. And that's where we get to Yanagi, for example. Now, we currently don't exactly know how Yanagi is going to perform. She is an anomaly electric unit that is likely going to be spending more time on field than Burnice, but she may also have some sort of off-field damage output, as the new drive disc that was released in the latest update, the Chaos Jazz, works by boosting the effectiveness of both fire and electric damage, and that damage increase is even boosted when the character is off-field. And I don't think the developers would introduce a drive disc with such a problem property unless there was going to be a character that is going to make specific use of that disc. So if you are planning on getting both Burnice and Yanagi, that is something to take into account, where you might only want to have one of them. Now, other characters that you should take into account when deciding to get Burnice are support characters that are not only synergistic but can also trigger their additional abilities in these teams. So naturally those would be Lucy and Caesar, who is not actually a support but kind of plays like one, as her shield is going to provide you with an effective damage increase that you really don't see anywhere else. Now me personally, I ended up skipping Caesar, or I should say, I really tried to get Caesar. In fact, I ended up spending over 160 wishes just to get her, but I ended up being unlucky. Not only did I fail the 50-50, but I'm also way too deep into pity to the point where I decided to simply save for Bernice, as I will have her guaranteed, and I might even be able to get 1 or 2 mindscapes for her. Now another thing that you should consider when it comes to deciding to pick Bernice or not is how powerful are your teams currently in the endgame, because if you already have 2 different teams that can comfortably clear the endgame of Zenless Zone 0 and get all the rewards from it, then there's frankly not much of a reason to pull for other characters. Now of course the endgame is going to get more difficult, but me for example, with a very free to play Jane Doe, that is to say with no mindscapes, only the Battle Pass W engine and not very powerful drive discs, I'm able to still clear her side of the shield defense with only around 2 minutes, and that is with 2 A-rank characters, those being Lucy and Seth. And while having Caesar on the team instead of one of them would make my Jane Doe a lot more powerful, I don't technically need her. And for you for example, if you already have Caesar King and you are doing a very comfortable clear on the endgame with your Jane Doe as well, it might be better for you to skip on Bernice, because you might not get as much benefit from her and you can already clear the endgame with a character that, in Caesar King's case especially, is going to work into any team, whereas Bernice is going to work with only anomaly characters. Now that being said, of course, the very most important thing when it comes to deciding a character, as I stated in my previous video, is actually how much you like them both visually but also when it comes to their own playstyle, because nothing could be worse than you saving up for a patch or 2, ultimately skipping a lot of characters because you are saving up for a new meta character, and then maybe you don't end up liking them as much. That happened to me with Genshin Impact, and I hope you don't make the same mistake, because it all goes back to gacha games being essentially resource games, and you need to be careful and manage your pulls, because unless you are insanely lucky or you are spending a ton of money, you're not going to get every character. Even I myself, as a content creator that I would categorize as a dolphin or a low spender, well actually probably just a dolphin at this point, as I've just told you I had to skip Caesar because I couldn't get her. I just happened to lose the 50-50 3 times in a row, and at this point I don't want to burn my wallet too much, especially considering that Bernice is already going to be burning it a lot. Now if you are pulling for Bernice and you are wondering, should you go for the mindscape, should you go for the W engine, how much are you going to benefit from these further investments, know that the character is going to more than perform without any of them, and I think especially the W engine, the Flamemaker Shaker, despite being very powerful by providing passive energy regen by 0.26 per second, as well as giving you a stacking EX special attack and assist damage increase, which is doubled while you are off field, and giving you a 50 additional anomaly proficiency bonus, which will pretty much always be active, you still have some very powerful free-to-play alternatives, with the Roaring Ride being very powerful for Burnice, and even the Fusion Compiler, Grace's signature W engine, is also very good, and for that fact, even the Electro Lip Gloss, the Battle Pass W engine, can also be effective on Burnice. So unless you are splurging on this character, I would say that you can totally skip the W engine. And when it comes to the mindscapes, it would actually be more beneficial for you to go for the first mindscape, if you can get it that is, rather than going for the W engine, because this mindscape is not only going to effectively increase the number of afterburn effects that you can trigger, it's also going to increase Bernice's overall fire anomaly build-up rate, thus allowing her to deal much more damage. Going for any other mindscape beyond that, I would say that it's a total overkill, especially if you go for Mindscape 6, but if you do get it, you are essentially turning Bernice into an on-field main DPS. Now a couple of final points as to why you may or may not want to pull Bernice. One of them is the energy concern, because we now have the 4-piece Chaos Jazz set, which is going to be the best in slot for Bernice by far, as it is going to give her 30 anomaly proficiency, on top of a 15% fire damage increase, and her EX special attack and assist damage are going to be increased by 20% when she is off field. So that is pretty much always going to be active, and the fact of the matter is that she is currently the only character that benefits from that set. Now that set is paired with also the new Protopunk set that you may may want to farm for Caesar, but if you don't have Caesar and you're not planning on getting Yanagi later down the road, because she is likely also going to be using the 4-piece Chaos Jazz disc, it can become a little bit of an energy sink, and again, it's all about resource management, so you should take this into consideration. Lastly, you need to take into account the A-rank characters that are featured in Burnice's banner. Now, thankfully, one of them is Lucy, which pairs very well with Bernice, being a competent support character that becomes very powerful with a few mindscapes, and if you don't have Caesar, Lucy is going to fit very well into Bernice's team. The second A-rank character that is featured on Bernice's banner is Nicole, which is also a very powerful character, although she currently only has one real meta team, which is the Juyuan team. So if you skipped out on Juyuan, there's not much of a reason for you to have multiple copies of Nicole, although you could be playing her with Nekomata, for example, or just as a standard defense shred character. But despite the lack of teams that Nicole has available at the current moment, she is definitely a very powerful support, and as we get more ether characters later down the road, she's going to become more valuable. So I would say that this is by far one of the very best character banners when it comes to the featured A ranks, certainly a lot better than Caesar's was in my opinion. So while I do not encourage summoning on a banner just to get the A rank characters and many mindscapes of them, if you end up being unlucky and you get a couple of A ranks along the way, just know that you're going to be getting mindscapes for 2 good characters. At the end of the day, the 3 most important things are: do you enjoy this character, do you like their playstyle, or do they improve your account in any way, shape or form? And if the answer to all 3 questions is yes, then you should definitely get this crazy blonde girl. I've already mentioned in some previous videos how I'm definitely going to be burning my wallet for her, but I hope that I was able to give you helpful advice, especially for those that are free-to-play players or low spenders that have much more limited summons and can only get a certain number of characters. I'm going to be releasing a guide for Bernice very soon, so stay tuned for that. But in the meantime, if you want to see more videos from me like this, please subscribe to the channel for better luck on your next 50-50. And if you don't, I owe you a cocktail.